Hi there and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, and we begin with breaking news on the war against Iran, with President Trump now threatening to level the country tomorrow, including its civilian infrastructure, unless Tehran makes a deal, essentially doubling down on his profanity-laced social media post over the weekend, demanding Tehran open the Strait of Hormuz as oil prices continue to climb. Speaking from the White House briefing room this afternoon, President Trump warned that Iran is facing total destruction, but provided little clarity on how much longer the war could last. Here's some of what he had to say.
The entire country could be taken out in one night, and that night might be tomorrow night.
Are you concerned that your threat to bomb power plants and bridges amount to
No, not at
crimes?
all. No, I'm not. I hope I don't have to do it.
Your messaging on the war has moved from the war is coming to an end to we're going to be bombing Iran to the Stone Ages. Right. And we've heard a range of those kind of messages. So which is it? Are you winding this down? Or are you escalating?
I can't tell you. I don't know. I can't tell you. Depends what they do. We're giving them till tomorrow, 8 o'clock Eastern time, and after that, they're going to have no bridges, they're going to have no power plants. Stone Ages, yeah. We have a plan, because of the power of our military, where every bridge in Iran will be decimated by 12 o'clock tomorrow night, where every power plant in Iran will be out of business, burning, exploding, and never to be used again. I mean, complete demolition by 12 o'clock. And it'll happen over a period of 4 hours if we wanted to.
Now, this comes amid reports of a potential 45-day ceasefire in the works. A White House official telling NBC News it's one of many things being discussed, though it remains unclear who exactly the White House is talking to inside Iran. The president was pressed about the state of negotiations twice today. First, during the White House Easter egg roll, and then again during his press briefing.
They've made a proposal, and it's a significant proposal. It's a significant step. It's not good enough, but it's a very significant step. They have made, they're negotiating now, and they've made a very significant step. We'll see what happens. I can't talk about ceasefire, but I can tell you that we have an active, willing participant on the other side. They would like to be able to make a deal. I can't say any more than that.
Now, Iran state media is reporting that Tehran is rejecting the possibility of a temporary ceasefire, instead emphasizing the need for the permanent end to the war. All of it coming after the president's expletive-laced social media post on Easter Sunday sent shockwaves across the globe, where he renewed his threat to launch strikes on Iran's civilian infrastructure if the Strait of Hormuz isn't open by his 8 p.m. deadline tomorrow, writing, quote, "Open the effing strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell." The president today defending that crude language.
Why did you use such vulgar language in that Truth Social post?
Only to make my point. I think you've heard it before.
Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Julie Tsirkin, NBC News national security reporter Gordon Lubold, NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons, and NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Julie, let's start with you. What else stood out to you from the president's press conference today?
Ryan, I'll start on those rescued airmen, because it was really interesting the level of detail that the president gave. At one point, he even wanted Dan Kane to provide the exact number of troops, military personnel that were involved in this effort, and Kane said he'd rather not, especially, Kane said, if they have to do this sometime again soon. I also thought the president, when he was asked in regards to that operation whether everybody was on board, he actually revealed that they weren't. He said a number of very senior military officials were nervous that this would be a very daring operation that could potentially cost lives, it would cost equipment, it would cost a lot of money. And again, as the president laid out, this was a plane that was taken out by a shoulder missile. Again, that was extremely interesting, and it was new. Now, in addition to that, the president did say on oil, for example, that he wants to seize the oil from Iran, but he won't do it, most likely because of people back home, that they wouldn't be satisfied with it. But the president did say, why does he want the oil? Well, he said, quote, "I'm I'm a businessman first. I thought that was extremely interesting, a notable omission from the president there, as well as the plan. The president repeatedly saying he will not provide details. Forgive that noise as you see the grass being cut behind me there. But the president did say when it comes to that plan that it could start at 8 p.m. tomorrow. It could last until midnight. It could go on for 4 hours. And then the president said all of Iran's power plants will be decimated. He was asked if that is a war crime under international law. It certainly could be. The president saying he believes the Iranian people would want that kind of move. He also again said that the Iranian regime had killed thousands of protesters over the last 2 months, again saying that he's not sure if this is a war that is escalating or is winding down as he considers a ceasefire proposal put forward this morning by Pakistan. Ryan?
Julie, do you get the sense the president is feeling a bit emboldened after the U.S. military operation to rescue the U.S. airman who was shot down?
Absolutely. Several times he detailed the military operation. I thought that exchange that I mentioned with General Keir, where Keir clearly did not want to give away classified intelligence, sensitive information, the president saying multiple times referring to the fact that those details could have made a movie. He talked about the fact that this was the most historic operation, essentially saying that it's never been done before. We know there have been countless risky and dangerous operations that have been conducted to rescue Americans, troops and civilians alike. But the president multiple times spoke about this operation in terms of forecasting and showing off American strength and might. Only, he said, the president, that this is something that Americans can do. He said the technology that we have, the anti-air defense capabilities, even the planes, the 155 aircraft the president said were involved in this is something that showcased the American military might. And again, it comes at a very critical point. You know, I thought it was even interesting when the president was asked about Artemis, right? The space shuttle operation that is taking place right now. He said it comes at a critical time so that the Americans can continue to showcase its might as they're involved in this war in Iran. So all of those things the president very eager to show off today.
And finally, the president also kind of alarmingly threatened jail time today for whomever leaked the news about the U.S. pilot who was rescued. Let's first listen to what he had to say.
We're looking very hard to find that leaker. So whoever it was, we think we'll be able to find it out because we're going to go to the media company that released it, and we're going to say, national security, give it up or go to jail.
Threatening jail time against reporters. How seriously do you expect the administration will pursue this investigation?
Ryan, this is something we know that has been weighing on the mind of the president for days. Ever since that leak first surfaced on Friday, we know that the White House was intentionally very quiet not to reveal details. When that first airman, the pilot, was rescued from Iran, again, the president not really saying much until the second airman was rescued in those early morning hours, the late night hours of Saturday, I should say. And so this is something I know that the White House is going to take seriously. In addition to those comments that you just heard, President Trump said that this was a leak that endangered the rest of the operation. They said that it became a much more difficult operation to rescue that second airman. Again, you had American personnel, hundreds of them, the president said, involved in this. You had 155 aircraft involved in this. And again, this was happening not in the middle of the night, but in broad daylight. So for those reasons, the president said it is extremely pertinent for them to find out who this leaker is. We know the administration has been trying to prevent leaks, a shift that we've seen in the president's second term than the first term. And so this is something I expect they will take extremely seriously, especially at the Department of Defense. We know Pete Hegseth there at the helm of that department has tried to keep media access restricted, and the message very carefully crafted coming from the Pentagon to whoever needs to hear it. Ryan?
Okay, Julie Tsirkin, thanks for that. Let's turn now to Gordon, who's in studio here with me. Obviously, the president's proud of this mission to save this airman. Obviously, we're very glad that he is home, but it did not come without a cost, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military aircraft that were lost as a result of this. What more can you tell us about what went into this mission, the planning and the execution of it?
Sure. So military always likes to talk about it's a planning organization. It sure came to bear in this case. And I think as this conflict has unfolded the last several weeks, the threat that something like this could happen was, planned for all the more. And so there was definitely a plan to kind of figure out in a vague way, like depending on the circumstances, how to go in. Again, as Julie said, and as the president said, there's stuff of Hollywood, like behind enemy lines, very risky. The first the first rescue of the first airman, as the president said, was done by day. Super perilous, very dangerous, but that was conducted fairly quickly, as we learned a little bit more about today. The second one, far more perilous, just because it required more assets, a lot of aircraft, a lot of personnel, and it was done under cover of darkness. I think, as Julie said and the president mentioned, I think the biggest thing to me that we learned was that what brought down the F-15E aircraft to begin with was a shoulder-fired weapon shot by any operative of the regime, and really kind of laid bare the perils not just of the Air Force and the Navy, which the U.S. military has all but decimated in many ways, but the individual threats posed by individuals on the ground.
And the president also talked about a contingency plan. They needed to use lighter aircraft. What more do we know about that?
Right. I think that's more the president just kind of providing commentary on an operation that he's clearly very intrigued by. As we know now, some of the aircraft went to the what they call the LZ, the landing zone, to retrieve the second airman once he was initially found. And they got stuck in the sand. But the U.S., and as the president mentioned today, even the contingency plan, the backup plan was, remarkable in and of itself. They had aircraft ready to come in and undo the problem after the other ones got stuck.
But amidst all of this and the good news about both airmen being saved, this is still a war that is raging by any measure. And Secretary Hegseth said today that it's the largest volume of strikes since the start of the war. They've already said that their air defenses have been decimated, that the nuclear program has been obliterated. What are they targeting with these strikes?
And I would note that the secretary has said that several times over the course of this conflict, the last several weeks, like this is going to be the biggest day. And so he's saying it once again. There's really no easy way for us to measure that other than these principals coming out and saying this. But they are continuing to go after, finish these conventional targets, the Navy, the Air Force, ballistic missile sites, what are known as command and control sites where top military officials operate, other headquarters buildings of the military. I think that they will continue to kind of prosecute against those targets for now to eliminate drone sites and drone manufacturing sites, which remain a problem until they get to a point where they decide to shift gears.
Okay, Gordon, thanks for that. Let's go now to Keir. Keir, how do we expect officials in Iran will react to what we heard from President Trump today?
Well, I think what we heard President Trump do today is to try to use what was once have been called the bully pulpit of the American presidency to push the Iranians into a compromise. And President Trump is frustrated that the Iranians haven't compromised, as Steve Witkoff said before the war, but frustrated that they haven't capitulated. And actually, the president said it out in that news conference very clearly. He described a particular situation. He didn't exactly say when this was, when he thought there might be a deal, and then Steve Witkoff, his negotiator, his envoy, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and the Vice President J.D. Vance came to him and said, I think the Iranians are breaking the deal. This is according to President Trump's account. And he said to them, to his team, if you like, okay, tell them to look out the window, and in 45 minutes we'll have hit a major bridge. And we know, of course, that bridge was hit. And what President Trump was describing there effectively is what he sees as his negotiating style, which is to threaten and even to take action while at the same time trying to hold out an offer of a deal. To your question, the issue is that the Iranians want quite a number of concessions in order to agree to a deal, including, and this is an important one for them, for example, an agreement that the US and Israel will never strike them again. Effectively, what you're seeing is the United States and Israel on the one side and the Iranians on the other side both indicate that they would like an end to this war, but they would like it on their terms. It sounds familiar. It's very much the kind of thing that I've been talking about in relation to another war between Russia and Ukraine. The question here is not about whether the two sides would like to stop fighting. They would. The question is, on what terms are they prepared to stop fighting?
And obviously, there's Israel, the United States, Iran's role in all of this, but there is a lot of interest for all these different Gulf states as well. And we're just over 24 hours from the president's deadline for Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz. I know you're in Saudi Arabia now. What is the mood like in these Gulf countries? Are they bracing for another major escalation, or do they hold out any hope that there could be an agreement before the deadline?
They are bracing. They are worried about it, no question. That being said, a number of the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, have been able to be very effective in protecting themselves from these missiles and drones, albeit some have got through, and the debris from interceptions has caused real damage. And it's interesting, the message that you hear from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries is actually similar to the kind of message you're hearing from President Trump, and that is this: we want the war to stop, but we don't want it to stop if what it ends up with is a weakened but angry and effectively empowered Iran. And that all goes to the question of the Strait of Hormuz and whether it can be opened up. And I think that is why it's very difficult to see how President Trump doesn't come to the conclusion that there's going to need to be more action by the United States in order to open up the Strait of Hormuz, possibly taking islands in the Strait, with all of the risks that will entail and all of the questions of boots on the ground that will raise.
Okay. Keir Simmons in Saudi Arabia. Keir, thanks for that. Now, Christine, to you. And you heard Keir talk about what is at stake with the Strait of Hormuz. It's obviously something that markets around the world are keeping a very close eye on. How do the markets react today from what we heard from President Trump?
Well, oil markets, quite frankly, rose when the president reiterated his threat about 8 p.m. tomorrow and a 4-hour window in which he could decimate civilian important energy structure inside Iran. So you saw crude oil go up. It's above $112 a barrel. Diesel prices are up $5 now. Look at gas above $4.12. And when I talk to experts, they say if you start to see oil prices continue to rise, maybe as high as $120 a barrel, then you're talking about $4.50 gas in the U.S. So all of this is not hypothetical. There are tangible effects right now of what's happening in the Middle East. You have less oil going through the Strait of Hormuz onto global markets. You have less oil being produced and liquefied natural gas being produced in some of these important places in the Middle East. So that's just less supply. Supply demand, college economics 101, when supply goes down, demand is still relatively high. That means prices go up.
And obviously, the place we're seeing it most specifically and immediately is at the gas pump, which you already outlined. But let's say Iran opened the Strait of Hormuz tomorrow by the deadline. Would that be enough to bring gas prices down in the near term?
I think you would see in markets probably a reaction where in the futures markets you would see oil prices come down in some in far out futures contract months, not to get too wonky about how these things are priced and traded. But if you are a gas station owner or operator in the United States, you're not going to be lowering gas dramatically in the very near term. Why? Because there's still less oil being produced and shipped through here. There's still a backlog of weeks, if not months, of getting things back up normal. It's not a switch, Ryan. As you know, it's not a switch that just goes on and off. I mean, there are long supply chain effects here. There's also diesel fuel, jet oil, jet fuel. There are all kinds of different products that have them moving through there, like fertilizer. So the knock-on effect is much, much more than what American drivers are putting into their gas tank. It's really a global oil shock that we haven't seen in a generation. Some experts say that we've never seen, and that's going to take some time to get back to normal, even if things miraculously just overnight went back to pre-war conditions.
Yeah, people traveling right now are seeing the sticker shock on their airline ticket as a result of this. Christine Romans, thanks as always for breaking it down for us. Joining me now, former Secretary of Defense and former CIA Director Leon Panetta, and NBC News military analyst, the retired Colonel Steve Warren. Secretary Panetta, let's start with you. We're now in the 6th week of this war. What is your assessment of the war so far, and what appears to be a shifting timeline and objectives of this military operation?
Well, without question, I think, as the president has said, we've largely achieved a great deal of our military objectives here. There's probably still a few targets that remain, but I think overall we have, in fact, achieved our military objectives. The problem is that in order to get to a ceasefire, which I think is where we all need to go, you've got to deal with the Straits of Hormuz. And that remains a fundamental issue that, if we don't address, is obviously going to put tremendous pressure on our economy and on the American people. So the key right now is for the president to try to see if we can at least work out a deal between allowing some kind of ceasefire in exchange for opening up the Straits of Hormuz. I think that is the best turnout that can happen in this 6th week of the war.
Okay, Colonel Warren, let's turn to you. We did learn quite a bit more about the details of the operation to rescue the 2 U.S. airmen in Iran. What stood out to you from what we learned today?
Well, 2 things really stood out to me. The first was that, hundreds of American military members willingly put their lives in danger to find our downed aviator. And I think that really speaks to the ethos that we try to live by in the military, which is, I will never leave a fallen comrade behind. We try to live by that. The other piece of that same ethos was demonstrated by that aviator, who never quit. That's the other piece of our ethos. I will never quit. And he never did. He stuck in there. And I think the other thing that stood out to me were those images of the aircraft that we had to leave, destroyed on the battlefield, right? Because we didn't want any of that equipment to fall into enemy hands. That's 2 C-130s, potentially some helicopters as well. All of that, we had to abandon that there, but we didn't leave a single thing for the enemy to gain.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Panetta, I want to play for you something that the former DHS Secretary Jay Johnson said on Meet the Press yesterday about the operation to rescue that airman. Take a listen.
I would encourage the President and the Secretary of Defense, consistent with operational security, share as much of that with the American public so that the American public can appreciate what goes into this kind of operation is more complicated than the bin Laden operation, for example.
Wow.
I'm not sure any of that.
That's saying something.
I'm not sure any of that justifies a $1.5 trillion budget request, but still, this was remarkable, and I think Americans deserve to see a lot more about it.
Mr. Secretary, you were in the room during the bin Laden raid. Do you agree with his assessment? Was this operation more complicated than the operation that killed bin Laden?
Well, not being there, it's hard for me to make a judgment one way or the other. I can tell you this: the bin Laden operation was a complicated operation that required intelligence people and special forces working together. Clearly, this operation was equally well planned. It involved intelligence sources, the CIA. It involved special forces being able to go in and conduct this operation. It was an outstanding operation. I give them a hell of a lot of credit. I have tremendous confidence in the ability of our military to do these kinds of things. And I would hope that the president would kind of use this as a way to try to determine what is the best path now to bringing this war to an end. That really is the key point in the 6th week of the war that I think everybody would like to have.
Mm-hmm. And Colonel Warren, we've talked a lot, and the president's talked a lot about all these military successes. He's even described Iran as being decapitated, but yet they were still able to shoot down a U.S. fighter jet. From what we learned today was just a shoulder-fired missile. What does this tell you about Iran's military capabilities, even if it's as downgraded as the Trump administration is suggesting?
All right. The military capabilities of Iran are significantly downgraded. I believe the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the commander of Central Command when they say that. I do believe them. But we have to understand that downgraded does not mean eliminated. We have to understand that, air superiority does not mean we are invulnerable. There are still weapons systems out there on the battlefield. The skies that we fly in today, while we have control of those skies, they are not the friendly skies. We cannot fly with absolute impunity. And that's something we have to keep in mind. Wars are dangerous, and this is a war.
And is that part of the problem, Colonel, in terms of trying to bring this to an end, that even if you have that superiority and you have the advantage militarily, it's very difficult for these things to come to an end in a neat and tidy way?
Well, war is never neat and war is never tidy. And my old boss, Secretary Panetta, understands the strategic level of this better than anyone. But what I will tell you is, in my experience, in order to get both sides at the table negotiating in good faith, one side or the other has to have had enough. One side has to say, uncle.
And to that point, Mr. Secretary, the president is now suggesting, in an effort, I guess, to make Iran say uncle, that he's willing to go after civilian energy and infrastructure and potentially its bridges. Do you believe that that strike would be lawful, and would it be crossing a red line that the U.S. military should not cross?
Well, obviously, it raises a lot of questions with regards to whether or not, it's legal or illegal. But I think the bigger question, very frankly, is what's going to be the payoff here? Let's assume he goes ahead and does the kind of destruction he's talking about. The one thing he can eliminate is the ability of Iran to keep the Straits of Hormuz closed. And what's going to happen as a result of those attacks is that the price of oil is going to continue to escalate. And it's the American people who are going to have to pay that price at the pump. So in some ways, there aren't any winners here. Both sides are going to lose a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And Colonel Warren, what type of retribution could come from Iran if the U.S. were to take that sort of strike or take that sort of action?
Well, we know, as we just discussed, that Iran still has capabilities. They still retain offensive capabilities. So I think you can expect to see strikes against civilian infrastructure in the Gulf region. For example, the desalination plants in many of the Gulf nations, additional strikes on their critical oil and natural gas infrastructure. So we can see, again, an escalation will bring an escalation. So as we escalate, I think we can expect the Iranians to do the same.
Okay, great conversation. Secretary Panetta, Colonel Warren, thank you both for your time and expertise. We appreciate it.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.